In the quiet corridors of Kensington Palace, where whispered conversations have shaped the fate of nations, one woman's final words would shatter a future king's composure and reveal the human heart beating beneath the crown. What Kate said in those precious last moments wasn't just goodbye. It was a revelation that would forever change how the world sees the royal family, and how a prince learned that sometimes the most powerful words are spoken when time is running out. This isn't just another royal story. This is about love, loss, and the courage to speak truth when it matters most. This is about the moment when protocol meant nothing, titles dissolved, and two people faced the raw reality of what really matters in life. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Kensington Palace as William stood by the tall windows of the drawing room, watching the groundskeepers tend to the roses his grandmother had loved so dearly. The irony wasn't lost on him that they were preparing for what might be Kate's final public appearance. While outside, life continued its relentless march forward. The gardens would bloom again next spring, but would she be there to see them? 3 months had passed since the diagnosis that had turned their world upside down. 3 months of specialists, treatments, hope, and crushing disappointments. The woman who had once walked confidently through these same halls, balancing royal duties with motherhood, now needed help to climb the stairs to their private quarters. Yet Kate insisted on maintaining her schedule, refusing to let the illness define her or rob her of the dignity she'd fought so hard to earn within the royal family. William turned from the window as he heard familiar footsteps approaching. Kate entered the room wearing a simple navy dress, her favorite pearl earrings catching the morning light. To anyone else, she might have looked perfectly composed, but William could see the subtle signs that betrayed her struggle. The way she paused slightly before sitting, the careful positioning of her hands to hide the tremor that had developed, the makeup that couldn't quite conceal the hollows beneath her cheekbones. "The children are having breakfast with Maria," Kate said, settling into the chair they positioned near the warmth of the fireplace. "George wanted to know if he could skip his piano lesson to spend more time with me today." Her voice carried that mixture of love and heartbreak that had become so familiar to William over the past weeks. "What did you tell him?" William asked, taking the chair across from her. These morning conversations had become precious rituals, moments of normalcy in a life that had become anything but normal. The children knew their mother was unwell, but they'd carefully shielded them from the full reality of the situation. How do you tell a 10-year-old prince that his mother might not live to see him become a teenager? I told him that music is important, but that we'd have extra time together this afternoon, Kate replied. I've been thinking about our conversation with the doctors yesterday, William, about the timeline they gave us. William felt his chest tighten. The doctors had been kind, but direct. 6 months, perhaps 8 if they were fortunate. The treatments that had initially shown promise had stopped working, and Kate's body was growing weaker despite her incredible determination to fight. She'd asked them to be honest, insisted on knowing everything, even when William had wanted to protect her from the brutal facts. I need to ask you something, Kate continued, and I need you to listen without trying to fix it or make it better. Can you do that for me? William nodded, though every instinct screamed at him to find a solution, to make calls, to demand that someone, somewhere, have an answer that could change their fate. But he learned over the years that Kate often needed him to simply listen, to be present without trying to solve every problem. I've been thinking about what I want to leave behind, she said. Not just for the children, though they're the most important thing, but for the monarchy, for the people who've supported us, for the causes I've championed. I want my final months to mean something more than just a tragic royal story. Kate, you don't have to worry about any of that, William began, but she raised her hand gently. I do have to worry about it, because it's who I am, she said. Being part of this family changed me, William. When I married you, I thought I was just marrying the man I loved. I didn't understand that I was also marrying history, responsibility, and millions of people I'd never meet, but who would somehow become part of my story. William reached for her hand, feeling how delicate it had become, how the wedding ring that had once fit perfectly now slid slightly on her finger. You've exceeded every expectation, Kate. You've modernized the monarchy in ways my grandmother never thought possible. You've shown people that royalty can be both dignified and human. But there's more I want to do, Kate said, her eyes taking on that determined gleam that William recognized from their early days together. I want to use whatever time I have left to really make a difference. I want to visit the children's hospitals one more time, but not for a photo opportunity. I want to sit with the families who are going through what we're going through. I want to talk to the mothers who are facing what I'm facing. The weight of her words settled over the room. Kate had always been drawn to children's charities, but her approach had evolved significantly since her diagnosis. The carefully choreographed royal visits had given way to longer, more meaningful encounters. She'd begun requesting that photographers limit their presence, wanting the focus to be on genuine connection rather than public relations. The palace staff are concerned about the physical demands, William said carefully. They're worried about you overexerting yourself, and frankly, so am I. I know, Kate replied, but I've been thinking about something my mother told me when we first started dating seriously. She said that privilege comes with responsibility, but responsibility without purpose is just burden. I don't want my illness to become just another burden for this family to bear. I wanted to serve a purpose. William stood and moved to the window again, not because he was drawn to the view, but because he needed a moment to process what she was saying. Kate had always been thoughtful about her role, but this conversation felt different. There was an urgency in her words that went beyond typical royal duty. What are you really asking me, Kate? I'm asking you to let me live fully for whatever time I've left, she said. I'm asking you to support me in making choices that might not be what the advisors recommend, but that feel right to me. I'm asking you to trust that I know what I need to do. The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. William understood that this wasn't really about royal duties or public service. This was about Kate's need to maintain control over her own narrative, to ensure that her story ended on her own terms rather than simply fading away in a succession of medical appointments and gradually diminishing public appearances. There's something else, Kate said softly. I want to document some things. Letters for the children, videos perhaps, thoughts about what I hope for their futures. But I also want to be honest about what this experience has been like. Not the sanitized version that will appear in the official biographies, but the real story of what it's like to face death when you're 39 years old with 3 young children. William turned back to face her, struck by the clarity in her voice despite the enormity of what she was suggesting. You want to write about your illness? I want to write about living with the knowledge that time is limited, Kate corrected. About how that changes your perspective on everything from daily arguments with children to the weight of royal responsibility. About how facing death makes you understand life differently. The family won't like that, William said. The idea of that kind of personal revelation, especially while I'm still alive to control the message. Kate finished. That's exactly why I want to do it now, William. I watch how royal stories get told after people die. The rough edges get smoothed away, the human struggles get minimized, and what's left is a polished version that serves the institution rather than honoring the person. William sat back down, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. This conversation was heading in directions he hadn't anticipated. What would you write about? Specifically, about the guilt of knowing that my children will grow up without their mother's guidance during their most formative years. About the fear that they'll remember me as sick rather than strong. About the strange gift of having time to say goodbye when so many people don't get that chance. Kate's voice remained steady, but William could see the tears gathering in her eyes. I'd write about how weird it is to plan your own memorial service, to choose readings that will comfort your husband and children. I'd write about the conversations we've had about whether you should remarry and how we've navigated that impossibly difficult topic. William felt his breath catch. They'd had those conversations late at night when the children were asleep and the weight of the future pressed down on them. Kate had brought up the subject with typical directness, insisting they discuss practical matters that William couldn't bear to contemplate. I'd write about how being royal has both complicated and simplified this experience, Kate continued. How having the best medical care in the world still can't change some outcomes, but how having resources has allowed us to make memories that other families in our situation might not be able to create. Kate, William said quietly, are you sure you want to put yourself through that? Reliving all of these feelings, organizing them into something coherent enough to share. I think I need to, she replied, for my own peace of mind and because I believe it might help other people. Think about how many families are dealing with similar situations, but without any voice, any platform to share their experience. If my story can help even a few people feel less alone, isn't that worthwhile? William considered her words, understanding that this wasn't just about Kate's legacy or even about helping others. This was about her need to process her own experience, to make sense of what was happening to her and to their family. Writing had always been one of Kate's ways of working through complex emotions. What would you need from me? He asked. Your blessing, Kate said immediately. Your support when the advisors tell us it's a bad idea. Your help in protecting whatever I create until I'm ready to share it, or until after I'm gone if that's how it works out. And the children? They're part of the story, but I'd be careful about their privacy, Kate said. This wouldn't be about exploiting their grief or turning their experience into entertainment. It would be about the reality of loving people you have to leave behind. William felt the familiar sensation of the ground shifting beneath him, the way it had when Kate first told him about the symptoms she'd been ignoring, hoping they would disappear. Everything about their lives had become about adapting to new realities, making decisions they'd never imagined they'd have to make. I need to think about this, he said finally. I know, Kate replied. But, William, don't take too long. We don't have the luxury of endless deliberation anymore. The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. Time, which had once seemed infinite, stretching out through decades of royal duties and family milestones, had become precious and limited. Every day of delay was a day they couldn't reclaim. There's one more thing, Kate said, standing carefully from her chair. I want to have a conversation with your father and Camilla about what this means for the monarchy, about how they want to handle the transition, about what support you and the children will need. Kate, that's not necessary. They understand the situation. No, William, I don't think they fully understand, Kate said. I think they're still hoping for some kind of miraculous recovery, some treatment that will change everything. I need them to understand that we're past that point and that we need to start planning for what comes next. William felt something close to panic rising in his chest. These conversations about what comes next felt like surrendering, like giving up hope they'd been clinging to despite the medical evidence. I'm not giving up, Kate said, as if reading his thoughts. I'm being realistic about what giving up would actually look like versus what fighting looks like for me right now. Fighting doesn't mean denying reality. It means making the most of whatever time I have left. She moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. I love you, William. I love our life together, our children, even the complications that come with being part of this extraordinary family. I want you to remember that when things get difficult, everything I'm asking for comes from love, not despair. William watched her leave the room, her footsteps growing fainter as she made her way toward the children's breakfast room. He remained seated in the drawing room, surrounded by portraits of his ancestors and the weight of centuries of royal tradition. For the first time since Kate's diagnosis, he began to understand that the real challenge wouldn't be just losing her. It would be honoring her wishes while also protecting their family and the institution they devoted their lives to serving. The morning sun had shifted, and the shadows in the room had moved, but William remained in his chair, contemplating a future that felt both urgently immediate and impossibly distant. Kate was asking for his blessing to document their most private pain, to share their family's grief with a world that was already watching their every move. She was asking him to trust her judgment during a time when everything felt uncertain. Outside, he could hear the children's laughter drifting from the breakfast room, George's voice rising above his siblings as he told some elaborate story. Normal sounds of family life continuing despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. Kate was right about one thing. Time was limited, and every decision they made now would echo through their children's lives and through the history of the monarchy itself. 2 weeks after their conversation in the drawing room, William found himself standing outside his father's private office at Clarence House. The ornate hallway, with its carefully curated collection of watercolors and antique furniture, felt more imposing than usual. He'd requested this meeting without fully explaining its purpose to King Charles, knowing that some conversations required the weight of physical presence rather than the distance of telephone calls. Kate's condition had deteriorated noticeably in the past fortnight. The fatigue that had once been manageable with careful scheduling now forced her to cancel appearances with little notice. The children had begun asking more pointed questions, particularly George, who'd inherited both his father's perceptiveness and his mother's directness. The carefully constructed normalcy they'd maintained was beginning to crack under the pressure of reality. "Your Majesty," the private secretary announced, "His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales." William entered the familiar room where his father sat behind an imposing mahogany desk, papers spread before him in neat piles. Charles looked up with the expression of mild concern that had become his default when dealing with family matters these days. Everyone was walking on eggshells, trying to balance hope with preparation for the inevitable. "William," Charles said, rising from his chair, "how is Catherine today?" "That's actually what I wanted to discuss," William replied, settling into one of the chairs arranged near the fireplace. "Kate has some requests, some ideas about how she wants to spend her remaining time. I think you and Camilla should hear them directly from her." Charles moved to the chair across from his son, and William was struck by how much his father had aged in recent months. The stress of Kate's illness had affected the entire family, but it seemed to weigh particularly heavily on Charles, who'd grown genuinely fond of his daughter-in-law over the years. "She's been writing," William continued, "documenting her experience, her thoughts about what's happening to our family. She wants to create something that might help other families going through similar situations." "Writing about her illness?" Charles asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Writing about living with the knowledge that time is limited," William corrected, echoing Kate's earlier distinction. "About how facing death changes your perspective on everything, including royal duty and family responsibility." Charles was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming silently on the arm of his chair. William recognized this gesture from childhood. His father was processing information that challenged his expectations. "What kind of writing are we discussing?" Charles asked finally. "Personal reflections for the family, or something intended for public consumption?" "She hasn't decided yet," William admitted. "But, knowing Kate, she's thinking about how her experience might benefit others. She's always believed that privilege comes with the responsibility to help people who don't have the same resources." "The timing concerns me," Charles said carefully. "Public discussion of such private matters while Catherine is still undergoing treatment might create complications we haven't considered." William leaned forward slightly. "Father, the doctors have been clear about the prognosis. Kate understands her situation better than any of us, and she wants to maintain control over her own narrative while she's still able to do so." The words hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of unspoken truths. The family had been operating under a kind of collective denial, focusing on treatments and hoping for improvements while avoiding direct acknowledgement of what the medical team had told them. "She also wants to make some changes to her official schedule," William continued. "Less emphasis on formal ceremonies and more time with the charitable causes that matter most to her. She wants to visit children's hospitals again, but in a different way. Longer visits, more personal interaction, fewer photographers." "That's perfectly reasonable," Charles said. "We can arrange whatever she feels capable of managing." "There's more," William said. "She wants to have conversations with families who are dealing with similar diagnoses. Not as a royal patron offering sympathy, but as a woman sharing a common experience. She wants to learn from them as much as offer comfort." Charles stood and moved to the window overlooking the garden, much as William had done during his conversation with Kate. That's a significant departure from traditional royal engagement protocol. Yes, it is, William acknowledged. Kate is asking us to trust her judgment about what feels right for her situation, even if it doesn't align with how things have typically been done. And what do you think about these requests? William considered his answer carefully. I think Kate has earned the right to determine how she spends whatever time she has left. I think her instincts about connecting with people have been proven right throughout her time as a working royal. And I think we need to focus more on supporting her choices than on protecting traditional protocols. Charles turned back from the window. You're asking me to approve activities that could generate significant media attention during an already difficult time. I'm asking you to support your daughter-in-law's final wishes, William said quietly. The directness of his statement surprised them both. William had been carefully avoiding such stark language, but Kate's influence was pushing him toward greater honesty about their situation. Final wishes, Charles repeated. William, are we certain that Catherine's medical team has exhausted all possible treatments? We've consulted with specialists across 3 countries, William replied. Kate has been remarkably thorough in seeking second and third opinions. Everyone agrees that we're looking at months, not years. Charles returned to his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 75 years. I've grown quite fond of Catherine over the years, he said. She's brought a wonderful energy to the family, and she's been an exceptional mother to my grandchildren. She knows that, William said, and she appreciates how welcoming you and Camilla have been, especially in comparison to how some royal spouses have been received historically. There's something else I need to discuss with you, Charles said. The question of your role going forward. Whether you want to take on additional responsibilities sooner than we'd originally planned. William felt the familiar weight of royal succession pressing down on him. These were conversations he'd expected to have years in the future, when his children were older and his own preparation more complete. Kate and I have talked about that, he said. She's encouraged me to consider stepping into a more prominent role, particularly with the charitable work she'll be unable to continue. She thinks it would help the children to see that her causes remain important to our family. That's very thoughtful of her, Charles said. But what do you want, William? How do you envision managing increased royal duties while grieving and raising 3 children as a single parent? The question hung heavy in the room. William had been so focused on Kate's needs and wishes that he'd barely allowed himself to contemplate the practical realities of life after her death. I don't know, he admitted. I suppose I'm hoping that taking on meaningful work will help with the grieving process. Kate often says that staying busy with purposeful activities helps her cope with difficult emotions. Grief isn't quite the same as fear, Charles observed gently. What works for Catherine now might not work for you later. Before William could respond, there was a soft knock on the door. Camilla entered with a measured grace that had become her signature, nodding to both men before taking a seat near Charles. I hope I'm not interrupting, she said, but I wanted to join the conversation if you're discussing Catherine's situation. William was telling me about some requests Catherine has made, Charles said. Changes to her official duties and some writing she's been doing. Camilla's expression grew thoughtful. I've noticed that Catherine seems more focused lately, more intentional about how she spent her time. It's quite admirable, actually. She wants to meet with both of you, William said, to discuss what support the children and I will need, and to talk about her hopes for how the monarchy might evolve in response to what our family is experiencing. Evolve how? Camilla asked. She thinks there's an opportunity for the royal family to be more open about human experiences that everyone faces, William explained. Illness, grief, the challenge of balancing public duty with private pain. She believes that showing vulnerability might actually strengthen the monarchy's connection with ordinary people. Charles and Camilla exchanged a look that William couldn't quite interpret. The idea of deliberate royal vulnerability was certainly not traditional, but then again, Kate had never been particularly traditional in her approach to royal life. She's also been thinking about the children's futures, William continued, about how growing up with the memory of losing their mother might affect their relationship with royal duty. She wants to ensure that they see service as something meaningful rather than merely obligatory. What does she envision? Charles asked. She talks about creating space for them to grieve openly, to ask questions about death and loss without worrying about public image. She wants them to understand that being royal doesn't mean pretending difficult emotions don't exist. Camilla leaned forward slightly. That's quite wise, actually. I've watched royal children struggle with the expectation that they maintain composure regardless of personal circumstances. It's not healthy for anyone, particularly children. Kate has always been good with the children, Charles agreed. Her instincts about parenting have been excellent from the beginning. There's one more thing, William said, knowing this would be the most difficult part of the conversation. Kate wants to plan her own memorial service. Not the state funeral that protocol would typically dictate, but something that reflects her personality and her relationship with the public. The silence that followed was profound. Royal funerals were matters of state, carefully choreographed events that balanced respect for the deceased with the needs of the institution and the expectations of the public. What kind of service does she have in mind? Charles asked carefully. Something more personal, William said. Music that means something to our family. Readings that reflect her actual beliefs rather than generic royal selections. She wants the children to be involved in planning it, to feel like they're honoring their mother rather than just participating in a ceremony. That would require significant departures from established protocol, Charles said. Yes, William acknowledged. Kate understands that. But she's asking us to consider whether those protocols serve the people we're meant to honor or just the institution itself. Camilla spoke up. I think Catherine raises a valid point. Some of our traditions exist because they've always existed, not because they necessarily serve their intended purpose. Charles looked surprised by his wife's support for such a departure from tradition, but William could see him considering the possibility. These are all significant requests, Charles said finally. I think we should indeed meet with Catherine directly. She deserves to explain her thinking in her own words, and we owe her the courtesy of listening with open minds. When would work for both of you? William asked. Tomorrow afternoon, Camilla said immediately. If Catherine feels well enough. I'll ask her, William said, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. Kate would be pleased that her requests were being taken seriously, but he worried about her energy levels and whether she'd be able to articulate her thoughts as clearly as she'd done in their private conversations. William, Charles said as his son prepared to leave, I want you to know that your mother would be proud of how you and Catherine have handled this situation. The dignity, the thoughtfulness, the way you've protected the children while also being honest about what's happening. It's not easy to balance those responsibilities. William felt unexpected emotion rising in his throat. His father rarely made such personal observations, particularly references to Diana, and the acknowledgement meant more than Charles probably realized. Kate has been the strong one, William said. I've mostly just been trying to keep up with her courage. That's what good marriages look like, Camilla said softly, taking turns being strong for each other. As William left Clarence House and made his way back to Kensington Palace, he reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. Kate's diagnosis had forced their entire family to confront questions about mortality, legacy, and the purpose of royal service that they might have avoided for years under different circumstances. The afternoon sun was casting long shadows across Hyde Park as his car approached the palace gates. Soon he'd be home, where Kate would want to know about every detail of the conversation, where the children would demand his attention for homework help and bedtime stories, where the normalcy of family life continued despite the extraordinary circumstances surrounding them. He found himself thinking about Kate's observation that facing death had clarified what really mattered. Royal protocols and centuries of tradition suddenly seemed less important than ensuring that his wife felt heard and supported during her final months. The monarchy would endure long after all of them were gone, but the way they handled this crisis would become part of its history. William realized that Kate wasn't just asking for personal accommodations. She was challenging the royal family to evolve, to become more human and accessible without losing its dignity or purpose. It was a delicate balance, but then again, Kate had always excelled at managing delicate balances. As he walked through the familiar corridors of their home, William heard the sounds of ordinary family life. Charlotte practicing violin, Louis arguing with his tutor about mathematics homework, Kate's laughter drifting from the kitchen, where she was probably helping with dinner preparations despite the staff's gentle protests. Tomorrow's meeting with Charles and Camilla would determine whether Kate's final wishes would be honored or whether the weight of royal tradition would override her personal preferences. But tonight, William was simply a husband coming home to his family, ready to create whatever memories time would allow them to share. The meeting with Charles and Camilla had been scheduled for 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but by 2:30, Kate was experiencing one of the episodes that had become increasingly frequent. William found her in their private sitting room, gripping the armrest of her chair with white knuckles as waves of nausea passed through her. Her face was pale, and the careful makeup she'd applied earlier had been washed away during a trip to the bathroom. "We can reschedule," William said, crouching beside her chair. "Father will understand." "No," Kate said firmly, though her voice was weaker than usual. "I need to do this while I still can, while I can still think clearly and express myself the way I want to." William understood what she meant. The medications that helped with the pain sometimes left Kate feeling foggy, less articulate than her usual sharp self. She'd been timing her doses carefully to ensure she'd be as clear as possible for important conversations. "At least let me ask them to come here," William suggested. "You shouldn't have to travel when you're feeling like this." Kate considered this compromise. The informality of meeting in their own home rather than at Clarence's house would actually serve her purposes better. She wanted Charles and Camilla to see their family environment, to understand the context of the request she was making. "All right," she agreed, "but I want to tidy up first. I don't want to look like an invalid for this conversation." "Kate, they know you're ill. You don't have to put on a performance." "I'm not putting on a performance," she replied, slowly rising from her chair. "But I want to look like myself when I ask them to honor my wishes. I want them to see the person making these requests, not just the patient." An hour later, Charles and Camilla arrived at Kensington Palace with the minimal security detail that family visits required. William met them at the private entrance, noting the careful expressions they both wore. Everyone had become expert at managing their emotions around Kate's situation, but the strain was visible in the set of their shoulders and the careful way they modulated their voices. "How is she today?" Camilla asked quietly as they made their way through the corridor. "Determined," William replied, which earned a small smile from his stepmother. Camilla had developed genuine affection for Kate over the years, appreciating her straightforward approach to royal life and her refusal to be intimidated by centuries of protocol. They found Kate in the drawing room, where she and William had held their first conversation about her final wishes. She'd chosen this room deliberately. It was formal enough to convey the seriousness of their discussion, but personal enough to feel like a family conversation rather than an official meeting. Kate stood to greet them, and William could see the effort it required. But she managed it with grace, embracing both Charles and Camilla warmly before settling back into her preferred chair near the fireplace. "Thank you for coming," she said. "I know this isn't a typical royal family discussion, but then, again, nothing about our situation is typical." "Catherine," Charles said, "first, I want you to know how much your courage throughout this ordeal has impressed all of us. The way you've continued your duties while managing your treatment, the care you've shown for William and the children, it's been extraordinary." "I appreciate that," Kate replied, "but I didn't ask you here to receive praise. I asked you here because I need your support for some decisions I want to make about how I spend whatever time I have left." The directness of her statement seemed to surprise Charles, though Camilla looked prepared for this level of frankness. Kate had always been more comfortable with direct conversation than many members of the royal family. "William mentioned that you've been writing," Camilla said, "about your experience with illness and how it's affected your perspective." "Yes," Kate confirmed. "I've been documenting what it's like to live with a terminal diagnosis while being a mother and a member of the royal family. The practical challenges, the emotional complexity, the way it changes your priorities. For personal reflection or for publication? Charles asked. I haven't decided yet, Kate said honestly, but I want the option to share it if I choose to. I think there might be value in an honest account of this experience, particularly for other families facing similar situations. Charles shifted slightly in his chair. Catherine, you understand the sensitive nature of personal royal revelations? The potential impact on the institution? I do understand that, Kate replied. But I also understand that the institution exists to serve people, not the other way around. If my experience could help other families feel less alone, less afraid, isn't that aligned with the royal family's mission of service? William watched his father process this challenge to traditional thinking. Kate was essentially arguing that royal duty might require sharing personal struggle rather than maintaining the traditional stiff upper lip. What kind of details would you include? Camilla asked, her tone genuinely curious rather than defensive. I'd write about the guilt of knowing that my children will remember me primarily as someone who is sick, Kate said. About the practical conversations William and I have had to have about his future, about whether he should remarry, about how to help the children maintain relationships with my family after I'm gone. Charles visibly winced at this level of specificity, but Kate continued. I'd write about how strange it is to plan your own memorial service, to choose readings that you hope will comfort your husband and children, about how being royal has both complicated and simplified this experience. Simplified how? Camilla asked. Having access to the best medical care, having the resources to create special experiences for the children, having staff who can manage practical details so William and I can focus on emotional ones, Kate explained. But also complicated because every decision we make becomes about balancing personal needs with public expectations. William could see that both Charles and Camilla were grappling with the implications of such candid revelation. Royal memoirs had always been carefully sanitized, focusing on public service rather than private struggle. There's another aspect to this, Kate continued. I want to change how I approach my remaining public engagements. Less focus on formal ceremonies and more emphasis on meaningful connections with people facing similar challenges. What does that look like practically? Charles asked. I want to visit children's hospitals again, but spend more time with individual families. I want to sit with mothers who have terminal diagnoses and talk about how they're preparing their children. I want to learn from people who've been dealing with these challenges longer than I have. That's quite different from traditional royal hospital visits, Charles observed. Yes, it is, Kate agreed. Traditional visits are about offering comfort and showing royal support. I want to do something more reciprocal. I want to acknowledge that these families have wisdom to share, that they might be able to help me as much as I might be able to help them. Camilla leaned forward. I think that's a beautiful approach, Catherine. Very authentic to who you are. Kate smiled genuinely for the first time since they'd arrived. Thank you. It feels right to me. I've always learned more from the people I've met through royal engagements than I've been able to offer them. What else? William prompted gently, knowing there were more requests Kate wanted to make. I want to plan my own memorial service, Kate said, addressing Charles directly. I understand that there are protocols for royal funerals, but I'd like to request some modifications that would make the service more reflective of who I actually am. The room went very quiet. Royal funeral protocols were among the most established traditions the family maintained, with procedures that have been refined over centuries. What modifications are you considering? Charles asked carefully. Music that's meaningful to our family rather than just traditional hymns, Kate said. Readings that reflect my actual beliefs and values rather than generic royal selections. I'd like the children to be involved in planning it, to feel like they're honoring their mother rather than just participating in a state ceremony. Catherine, Charles began, but Kate raised her hand gently. I'm not asking you to abandon all protocol, she said. I understand that there are expectations for royal funerals, obligations to the public, and to other members of the family. But I'm hoping we can find ways to honor those obligations while also making the service feel personal and authentic. What kind of music are you thinking about? Camilla asked. Some classical pieces that William and I chose for our wedding, Kate replied. Some contemporary songs that have meaning for our family. I'd like George to read something if he feels comfortable doing so. I want people to remember me as someone who lived fully rather than someone who died tragically. William could see his father struggling with these requests. The tension between personal wishes and institutional requirements was always present in royal life. But Kate's situation made it particularly acute. There's one more thing, Kate continued. I want to have honest conversations with the children about death and grief. I want them to understand what's happening to me and to feel free to ask questions without worrying about protecting everyone else's feelings. How do you plan to approach that? Camilla asked, age-appropriately, but honestly, Kate said. I want them to know that being sad is normal and healthy. I want them to understand that missing me doesn't mean they can't also be happy and excited about their lives. I want them to see that death is part of life, not something to be terrified of. That's quite progressive for royal children, Charles observed. Maybe it's time for royal children to be raised more like other children in some ways, Kate replied, with space to experience and express genuine emotions rather than just maintaining proper composure. William watched his father consider this challenge to traditional royal child-rearing. The conversation was touching on fundamental questions about what the monarchy should be and how it should relate to ordinary human experiences. Catherine, Charles said finally, these requests represent significant departures from how we've traditionally handled royal illness and death. I want to be supportive of your wishes, but I also have responsibilities to the institution and to the public. I understand that, Kate said. I'm not asking you to make these decisions immediately. I'm asking you to think about whether our traditions serve their intended purpose or whether they sometimes prevent us from being as helpful and meaningful as we could be. What timeline are we working with? Camilla asked gently. Kate looked at William, who nodded encouragingly. The doctors think I have maybe 4 to 6 months, she said. Possibly longer if I'm fortunate, but probably not much longer. The stark honesty of this statement seemed to settle over the room like a heavy blanket. Everyone had known the general situation, but hearing Kate state the timeline so clearly made it impossible to maintain any comfortable illusions. Then, we need to make sure these months are meaningful for you and for your family, Charles said quietly. I'll need to discuss some of these requests with my advisors, but I want you to know that my inclination is to honor your wishes wherever possible. What about the writing? Kate asked. I like to read what you've created so far, Charles replied. Not to censor it, but to understand what you're hoping to accomplish. If your goal is genuinely to help other families, then I think we can find a way to support that. Kate's relief was visible. Thank you. That means more to me than I can express. And the changes to your public engagements? William asked. We'll work with your team to modify your schedule however you'd like, Camilla said. If you want to spend more time in meaningful conversations and less time in formal ceremonies, we'll make that happen. As the conversation continued, William found himself struck by how Kate's direct approach was changing the dynamic of royal family decision-making. Instead of careful diplomacy and indirect suggestions, she was stating her needs clearly and asking for specific support. It was refreshing and effective, though he wondered if it would work as well for other family members in less extraordinary circumstances. There's one thing I'd like to ask of both of you, Kate said as their meeting began to wind down. I'd like you to help William and the children remember me as someone who was strong, not just as someone who was sick. I want my legacy to be about how I lived, not how I died. That's something we can absolutely promise, Charles said, his voice carrying more emotion than usual. As they prepared to leave, Camilla embraced Kate carefully. You're handling all of this with remarkable grace, she said. I hope you know how much we all admire your strength. After Charles and Camilla had gone, Kate and William remained in the drawing room, both emotionally drained from the intensity of the conversation. That went better than I expected, Kate said. You were very persuasive, William replied, but also very honest about what you need. I think that made it easier for them to support you. I don't have energy for diplomatic approaches anymore, Kate said. If I want something to happen, I need to ask for it directly. William understood that this was part of what facing terminal illness had taught her. The luxury of indirect communication, of hoping others would understand her wishes without explicit statement, was something she could no longer afford.